Hey guys, so this has been an interesting one. We are going to cover Colonel Richard Calloway, or Dick as he was known by his friends. So Dick Calloway and the lives of Dick Calloway and Daniel Boone were very intertwined. And your ancestor kind of got the short end of the stick. That's what happens when you die younger and the other guy lives to tell the tale. So let me back up and tell you a little bit about Richard Calloway. So Richard Calloway's grandfather came over from England. We don't know a whole lot about him, but he ends up landing in Virginia. So Richard Calloway's born into a family of, there's six boys in the family, and shortly after Richard is born, his parents and one of his brothers die of fever. As he becomes an adult, what happens is the oldest son of that family ends up inheriting the house and land. Primogeniture was still big at the time, so he just moved on, and as did most of his brothers. They just moved on and started to build lives for themselves. And he is doing so mostly in Bedford County, Virginia. So when he's 29, in his late 30s, he has already married his wife Frances, and they've already had a few kids. He would end up having like 15 children. I mean, it's just a huge family. So anyway, in 1746, he is a constable in Lunenburg County, Virginia. And then what happens is in 1754, the French and Indian Wars break out. And so from 1754 to 1763, Richard Calloway he's in his late 30s, early 40s by this time, and he serves with distinction in the French and Indian War, and he becomes a colonel by the end of it. Now his brothers served as well. So he had one brother. The way it worked was one brother was in charge of one fort. So Richard had his own fort that he was in charge of. His other brother was in charge of another fort, and another brother was in charge of another fort. And when they were in charge of those forts, they were in charge of the building of them, the maintenance of them, the protection of those forts. So he learned a lot as the leader of these forts. And then obviously he was a colonel. So during this time, he fought mostly Indians. So he basically spends his life fighting Indians. I mean, this was what it was like when you lived on the frontier. He lived on the Virginia frontier. So they had to protect hundreds of miles of the Virginia frontier against Indians. That was the job of the Virginia militia. So after he serves with distinction in the French and Indian Wars, he does a number of things. So, he becomes justice of the peace. He's a lot of different things, but he's also what became known and famous actually for that time. He is a long hunter. Now, a long hunter, you would think that a long hunter was somebody who had a long gun, but nope, that's not the case. A long hunter was someone who would go out. These guys were true frontiersmen. They would go out in certain times of the year. They would plan these hunts all year, and then they would go at a certain time of the year, and they would be gone on a hunt for months, sometimes up to 6 months. And they were called long hunters because it took so long. And they would come back at the end with just tons of furs and stuff, and that's how they would make their money and supplement their income. Now, during this time, when he's in Virginia with his brothers are all in Virginia as well. When he's in Virginia, for a short time, he moves to North Carolina, and he is next door neighbors with Daniel Boone during this time. And Daniel Boone and he are long hunters, right? So they go out and hunt, and then for a brief time, Daniel Boone moves down to Virginia. So Dick Calloway moves back to Virginia. He only lived in North Carolina a short period of time. He moves back to Virginia, and Boone ends up moving to Virginia. And so again, Daniel Boone was very good friends with all of the Calloway brothers, actually. And so they had experience going into the wilderness of what was then Kentucky. Now, Kentucky didn't exist at the time, but it was still called Kentucky. And there was no trail into Kentucky. So what ended up happening was that Boone was working for a man named Henderson. And Henderson had heard all these stories that Boone would tell about his hunts and stuff. And so Henderson's like, let's build a colony out and let's call it Transylvania. Let's do it out there in the Kentucky region and let's call it Transylvania. So Boone heads out. Now Boone he was a Quaker. He grew up as a Quaker. Welsh, his family was Welsh. But he didn't make it very long in the Quaker faith. And he just kind of got excommunicated somewhere along the way. But during that time, the Quakers had very good relations with one of the Indian tribes. I can't remember which one. So Daniel Boone was actually pretty comfortable around Indians. He had dealt with them his whole life. He had been a fur trader with them. So he goes out on behalf of this Henderson, who is putting together a group of investors to form in what was called the Transylvania Company. And this was the Transylvania colony that they hoped to build out there on the frontier. So Boone goes out and makes this deal with the Cherokee, and he buys from the Cherokee, tens of thousands of acres from the Cherokee, and the Transylvania Company's like, okay, great. Now you need to make the trail out there. So Boone asks his friend Dick Calloway, they've already hunted together. They were already long hunters together. And so Dick Calloway knew the trail just as, knew the ins and outs of hunting and going off into that frontier just as well as Boone did. So he asks Dick Calloway to join him. Now, Dick Calloway is about 15 years older than Daniel Boone. So I don't know what the relationship was like. I wonder if it wasn't a little bit, older brother, younger brother. I'm not sure. You get the impression that Daniel Boone is less polished and that Dick Calloway is more military. You just get the impression from what I've read about him, that just seems to be the case. Daniel Boone, he could read and write, but not well. When he would write letters, everything would be spelled phonetically, misspelled. So they head out and they head out through the Cumberland Gap in the Cumberland Mountains, and they literally blaze the first trail over into Kentucky, through Kentucky, Tennessee. Anyway, they blazed the trail, and it would later be called the Wilderness Trail. Now, if you look up the Wilderness Trail online, all you're going to get's Daniel Boone's name, because he sucks all the air out of the room. Can you tell I'm bitter? Because I am bitter. Anyway, so they blaze this Wilderness Trail and not only just mark it, but force it out, start to clear it. And it's him, Dick Calloway, and some other guys. There's 30 of them that blaze this Wilderness Trail. So then they go back, they meet with Henderson, the Transylvania Company guy, and they plan what they're going to do, which is build a fort. They're going to build a fort out there, and from there they're going to start to build this Transylvania colony. So Dick Calloway, so what the deal is that Daniel Boone's supposed to kind of lead the expedition. Dick Calloway's in charge of the military aspect of it. And also, because Dick Calloway had so much experience in the French and Indian Wars with forts and building forts and stuff, he is sort of the advisor on how to build this fort when they get there. They're originally going to call it Boone's Fort, but they all decide that sounds too militaristic, so they end up calling it Boonesboro. But so they head off. And it's, Dick Calloway, Daniel Boone. And by the way, so this whole time, Daniel Boone loses a son to the Indians. Dick Calloway loses a son to the Indians. This was not an easy time to live on the frontier. Daniel Boone had already been captured twice by Indian tribes and escaped once and was given over. But he had lived with them for a little while. It reminds me kind of Sam Houston's story. But in any event, they head off to build Boonesboro, which they do. They head off through this dangerous trek, and they begin to build Boonesboro out in Kentucky. And they are like one of the first guys out there. I mean, this is nobody. There is nobody out there. They are literally blazing the trail. So they do. They go there and they do build Boonesboro. Dick Calloway and Daniel Boone build Boonesboro. But their fort, they are under attack. Now, all this is going on. I didn't even tell you the time period. So all this is going on right as the American Civil War, or not the American Revolution, sorry. Right as the American Revolution is going on, these guys are out in the Kentucky frontier. So they are, they're patriots. They're patriots. They are on the side of the Americans. But what ends up happening is that all of the British Army, the redcoats basically dealt with the major cities. But out on the frontier, the war was being fought by Indian tribes loyal to one side or the other. So when they were out in Kentucky and building Boonesboro and trying to build a life there, planting things and planting gardens and when they were out there, they were just constantly attacked. They were constantly attacked by Shawnee. Well, that was the big Indian tribe that was on them all the time. So what ends up happening is that one day, 3 young girls get tired of being in the fort. And one of them, Jemima Boone, who's the daughter of Daniel Boone, gets her ankles like hurting or something like that. So she wants to go down, and they all get in this canoe on a nearby river, and they're just kind of lazing around. Jemima Boone's, I think, 16. Fanny Calloway is like 14 or 13. And then there's another one, I think her name's Betsy. But anyway, 2 Calloway girls and Jemima Boone. So while they're on the canoe, just floating, yakking, Jemima's got her foot in the water. Out of the bushes come these Indians. And so Fanny Calloway, sorry, she takes the oar and she's trying to hit this Indian as he's trying to pull their canoe. Well, they end up grabbing one of the girls by the hair, and they make this we're going to cut your throat sign. And so the girls end up getting kidnapped by these Shawnee Indians. And so one of the brothers, one of the Calloway sons, because like I said, so Dick Calloway had a ton of kids, 15 kids. So he comes running back to Boonesboro, to the fort, and he's like, they got the girls. So, Daniel Boone's trying to tug on his pants. Dick Calloway's running down to the river, filling his gun, filling his musket, all this stuff. Well, so Dick Calloway hops on his horse and some other guys, and they go out after him. Anyway, what ends up happening is they meet back. It gets dark. So they meet back, and Dick Calloway, Daniel Boone, and a bunch of other guys set out after them to track the Indians. Now, this whole tale, which would be one of the most famous of Daniel Boone's life, this whole tale is fictionalized in the book by James Fenimore Cooper, The Last of the Mohicans. And, I just had so much fun learning about all this, because that is one of my favorite movies of all time, The Last of the Mohicans. I've seen it countless times. I've made all the kids watch it. So that story about the girls, getting kidnapped and taken up into Ohio lands that's exactly what happened. So these guys are headed to Ohio, where it's kind of Indian land, and that's where they're going to take these girls. And Daniel Boone knows this because they know about Indians, and he's very familiar with Indians. So he knows that they're probably being taken up that way. So as they head out, they're tracking. The girls, in the meantime, are pretty clever, because they're trying to mark the way. They're trying to drag their feet when they can. I mean, they're also just crying a lot. The Indians end up ripping their petticoats off at the bottom, because their dresses were slowing them up. So the girls try to leave little signs. They try to break branches. Well, the Indians notice and they're like, do it anymore. They basically get the point across. Don't do it or we're going to kill you. So it takes like 2.5, 3 days. And finally, what ends up happening is Boone and Calloway decide, okay, Calloway's going to go. They know that they're taking him up north to the Ohio Indian lands. So he's like, Boone's like, okay, you go up, you cut him off at the pass in case we can't catch him. So Calloway heads up with his guys on horseback to cut him off at this pass. And Boone and his guys are following what they think is a trail. They lose the trail, they find the trail, they lose the trail, they find the trail. Finally, they come upon the girls in the clearing, and the guys are off. One of them's dealing with a fire, and but basically, out of the blue, they come upon him. And so Daniel Boone, who was a good shot, he shoots one of these guys in the chest, and all of the other Indians just basically run off. And so they rescue the girls. I mean, it's this wonderful thing. So that happens actually it happens like the day as the Declaration of Independence. It's 1776. It's right as the Declaration of Independence is being signed. That's when these girls get kidnapped by the Indians. But they're saved and brought back to Boonesboro. So what ends up happening is that as they prepare, like I said, they are under attack all the time by Indians. So they're having trouble because they don't have the Indians have come through and burned their crops. Like they've tried to grow crops. The Indians have come through and burned their crops. So all they're eating basically is meat from hunting. They just have meat, and more meat. And they run out of salt. Now, salt was absolutely vital because it was a preservative, right? So they went to, there are certain areas that are like salt springs, so they went to this area called Licking Springs. So Daniel Boone, Calloway's back at Boonesboro. Daniel Boone, now there's about 90 guys, about 90 guys there at Boonesboro at the time. So Daniel Boone takes 30 of them. He takes 30 and they all head to what was called Licking Springs, which was basically a salt spring. And the way they would do it is they take all these pots and then they boil it down, and then what's left is the salt. It was very time consuming. It took a long time. So they were doing this for days and days and days. And then, some of them would run the salt back to Boonesboro. So while they're out there doing this the salt boilers, as they would later be called, they would be called the salt boilers. So while the salt boilers are all down by this river, boiling salt, laying around on the rocks in the sun, just chilling, Daniel Boone goes out to hunt by himself, which he liked to do. And he is captured by several Shawnee, and they take him back to this Shawnee camp. Now, all this is only based on Daniel Boone's story. We have no other story to corroborate what happened when he's captured, which would actually be a problem later. But so he's taken to this Shawnee village where he sees that there are over 100 Indians there, and that they are about to camp, or that they are about to attack Boonesboro. That's what he believes. That's what Blackfish, who's the leader of the Shawnee tribe, who actually Boone already knew previously, was like, we're about to attack the fort. So supposedly Boone's thinking, well, the fort's in a bad way, we're going to get ourselves killed. So his story is that in order to buy time, he cuts a deal with Blackfish of the Shawnee, who are, they are allies to the British. So he cuts this deal with Blackfish, and he says, I'll give up all these guys at the, all these salt boilers over here, and you can use them to supplement, because the practice was when Shawnee were killed in battle, anybody that they captured could be basically forced into their tribe. They just adopted them into their tribe. So you had a lot of white people that ended up being members of these tribes because they needed people to replace the ranks of those braves that were killed. It's crazy. You would think it wouldn't work, but anyway. So Daniel Boone cuts this deal, and he says, I'll give you all these salt boilers, and you will have the victory. You know how they always talk when they're talking to Indians. You will have, the river will not flow with red, and you will have, anyway. So he basically cuts this deal, and he says, you can have all the salt boilers, but they don't have to go through the gauntlet. So the gauntlet, well, in any event, they don't have to go through the gauntlet. So he cuts this deal. So they go back to where the salt boilers are, and they're all just laying around, and they hop up with their guns ready to fight these Indians. And Daniel Boone says, no, put your weapons down. You know, we're going with them. So they say, okay. So they end up living with the Shawnee for 4 months, during which time, so when they finally get to the Shawnee village, Blackfish is like, they're setting up the gauntlet to run the gauntlet. And Daniel Boone's like, hey, we made a deal that the guys wouldn't have to run the gauntlet. And Blackfish says, we made the deal that they don't have to run the gauntlet. You have to run the gauntlet. Now, the gauntlet's basically where you have to run through this line of guys who all beat you up as you run through this line. Kind of like an initiation ceremony, I guess. He runs the gauntlet, he gets beat up, and then they shave his, I forget what, it's not top knot, but it's called something like that, where they shave his whole head except for this like little ponytail, like right up here. So Daniel Boone's whole head shaved all the way except for this ponytail up here. So he's there, and he gets adopted by Blackfish, who's the chief of the tribe. Blackfish takes him up to Detroit to talk to the British military. And while he's there, and we know what happened based on eyewitness accounts by the salt boilers, who are basically pressed into being members of the Shawnee. Well, not all of the salt boilers. Some of them are nice about it and do what's asked of them, but some of them, 2 of those salt boilers, are nephews of Dick Calloway. And one of them, James Calloway, is not having it. Like, he's not going to just become a Shawnee member. And so when they tell him to, hold a bucket, he just drops it. I'm not going to hold the bucket, right? So what they end up doing is they end up selling. The Shawnee they meet the Brits, who are their allies, and they end up selling 5 of these salt boilers, and they get rid of the ones that are trouble, like James Calloway. So James Calloway gets sold to the Brits, where he later gets sent up to Canada and everything. He doesn't even get to come back until after 1780. So, and the other Calloway nephew ends up getting sort of adopted into that Shawnee tribe. So while Boone is there in Detroit speaking to the British military at the time, he's like, yeah, I'll give you Boonesboro. So, and he had already promised this to the chief. He had already said, I'll give you Boonesboro. Let them sit out the winter and starve, and then when we come in the spring, we can take them, because they'll be so weak and they will have so few men, because we took 30 of their fighters. Now they've only got less than 60 left, and I will get them to come over to your side. Now, so the Brits are like, okay. So they buy the 5 salt boilers off of them, and then the Shawnee leave Detroit and end up going back to their village, where they spend, like I said, the salt boilers and Daniel Boone are in that village for like 4 months. And Daniel Boone's just having a grand old time. I mean, he's laughing. He's the adopted son of Blackfish. There's even word that he takes a wife, an Indian wife. And during this time, one of the salt boilers escapes. His name's Johnson. So he gets back to the Boonesboro fort, and he tells Calloway and all the people back at Boonesboro, this is what happened. He cut this deal with Blackfish. He cut this deal with the Indians, and he cut this deal with the Brits to sell you guys out. And he says that he's going to get Boonesboro to surrender when he comes back. Now, So Boone's family like heads back to Virginia. They don't even stay at Boonesboro, except Jemima. She's the only one who stays because she's married to Flanders Calloway, who is another nephew of Dick Calloway. So Jemima Boone ends up marrying a Calloway. So they stay in Boonesboro. But other than that, the entire Boone family heads back to Virginia. So you got to understand. So Dick Calloway and the other members of the fort at Boonesboro are thinking for months that, that Boone has betrayed them. So Boone finally escapes. The spring occurs and Boone escapes. I mean, this is all Boone's story, right? So Boone escapes and comes back to Boonesboro. But he looks like an Indian, right? He's got to be really careful about it because he's got the shaved head with the ponytail. So he looks like an Indian when he shows up, and he's dressed like an Indian when he shows up. So he's got to be careful. He's got to call out. He's got to have the white flag, the whole nine. So finally he gets in the fort and he tells them all that it was just a ruse to buy them time so that the Indians wouldn't attack right then because they would have all been wiped out. And that Boone said, all I was trying to do was save the lives of the salt boilers and save the lives of you guys. Now, it's clear that Dick Calloway certainly did not trust him. And so what ends up happening is they're trying to build the defenses of the fort. Another guy, General Benjamin Logan, who's got Logan's fort nearby, sends some men to help him out. Benjamin Logan actually is the son of David Logan, who is another ancestor of yours. So anyway, he sends some guys over to help out. And they know that the Shawnee are about to attack in force any day. And so while they're in there, like right before, Daniel Boone says, I'm going to take about 30 guys and I'm going to go steal some horses from this Indian village down the way. Calloway's like, no way, this is a bad idea. You're going to take 30 of our fighting guys out of the... He just thinks it's so stupid. Now, historians today don't really know why Boone does this. They think it's because he can sense that he's not exactly trusted, so he's trying to like prove his, courage and everything. So he takes a bunch of guys out to raid these horses from a nearby Indian village. But as they do it, they come across and they realize that the Shawnee are attacking. So they turn around, they come back, and they get back into the fort the night before the Shawnee attack. Now, what ends up happening is Boone agrees to go out to meet. So like over 450 Shawnee Indians come to take Boonesboro. Now, who's inside? 70 guys. So there's 70 guys inside the fort at Boonesboro and over 450 Shawnee Indians outside of it. So Boone goes out to meet with Blackfish and to try and, talk him out of it, I guess. I don't know what. So at the time, Dick Calloway's like, Boone's like, I'm going to go over here, way over here under these trees where we're going to meet. Dick Calloway's like, why are you going to take all of our leadership and we're going to go way out there where the guns can, we're not within gun range. We're not protected. We could lose all of our officers. Well, anyway, so Boone gets his way. They go out and Blackfish tries to get him to surrender. And so they end up, that kind of ends in a little bit of a scuffle where the Shawnee do indeed try to take the leaders, but they manage to, get away, firing shots and everything, trying to get away back to Boonesboro, which they do. They get back to Boonesboro. Now they go in, and Daniel Boone calls everybody around, and he's like, okay, there are over 450 Shawnee Indians out there. I believe I can get us good terms of surrender. If you guys feel that, you can't win this fight, I believe I can get us good terms of surrender. But I will do whatever you want. Whatever you guys all decide to do, that's what I'll do. And so some of them are hemming and hawing. A lot of them are saying, no, let's fight. So finally, Dick Calloway stands up and he goes, the next person who says anything about surrendering to these Indians, I will shoot in the head. Anyway, that ends up being like the last of the discussion. So Daniel Boone's like, okay, everybody's made their decision. I'll fight alongside with you. Now, after that decision is made, by all accounts, Daniel Boone fought, ferociously, and they were under siege for days and days and days. And they managed to, the Indians tried to tunnel under there, and so they threw like homemade bombs, kind of. It was just, the siege of Boonesboro is actually pretty famous. So they managed to hold off the Shawnee, and they make it through it. They make it through the siege of Boonesboro. So all that time, so here's Calloway. So what ends up happening is that after the siege of Boonesboro, Calloway brings court-martial proceedings along with Benjamin Logan, General Benjamin Logan, who is from the nearby fort, who sent men. They bring court-martial proceedings against Daniel Boone. And Calloway basically says, look, you're a traitor. I think you went off with those guys. You cut this deal. And according to later kin of Calloway, they said that Boone was trying to get out of the fight the whole time. Now, I don't know if that's true. Don't know. But General Calloway was not having it. So, or Colonel Calloway, Dick Calloway, was not having it. So they brought court-martial proceedings. And the main guys that testified were Dick Calloway, Benjamin Logan, this guy Johnson, who had escaped from the Shawnee and came back and warned Boonesboro. And so they ended up, and Daniel Boone got up and spoke for himself on his side of it. And he didn't contest any of the things that Dick Calloway said. He just said that I was trying to fool them the whole time. So Dick Calloway's like, why'd you tell him where the salt boilers were? You put all those guys in danger. You didn't have to tell them where the salt boilers were. And he's like, they already knew. Well, who knows? Who knows? I don't think we'll ever know. So, but you got to understand why Dick Calloway was so mistrustful. Other frontiersmen had already turned towards the British, and Daniel Boone's wife's family were Tories. So, this was a time of shifting loyalties. And so, you've got Dick Calloway, who's already had a son killed by Indians. He spent his life fighting Indians. His daughter's kidnapped by Indians. He has to go rescue her. And then, Boone wants to cut some sort of deal with these Shawnee Indians, and he's not having it. So what ends up happening is Daniel Boone not only survives the court-martial, they promote him. And this absolutely infuriates Dick Calloway and the other guy, I forget his name. Anyway, Benjamin Logan. So Dick Calloway would never speak to Daniel Boone again, which actually wouldn't be very long, because so they'd head back to Boonesboro. And Daniel Boone, you would think, oh, he would, now that he's been vindicated, he will say, no, he doesn't. He heads out. And who ends up staying is Dick Calloway. So I just wonder if Dick Calloway wasn't right about Daniel Boone, if Daniel Boone didn't have it in his mind the whole time that he was going to get Boonesboro to surrender to the Brits and to the Shawnee. I don't know. So 2 years later, Daniel Boone's already left Boonesboro, and he's gone somewhere else. So the place that bears his name, he's not even there anymore. And Dick Calloway is there, though. And he is, he's been appointed Justice of the Peace by Patrick Henry, who's the governor of Virginia. So Kentucky wasn't a state at that time. Kentucky was just a bunch of counties that were members of Virginia, of the state of Virginia. So, Dick Calloway ends up being the first House of Burgess member appointed from Kentucky to represent Kentucky's interests. And he gets permission to run this ferry. So this is going to be a really profitable deal, this ferry that he's building at Boonesboro. So he's out with his guys building this ferry down by the river, building this ferry, when they are attacked by Shawnee, and he is murdered in a really bad way. They scalp him. So evidently Richard Calloway had some pretty distinctive locks. He had like dark black hair, but streaked with salt and pepper. So they scalp him, they cut him up. Later, when they find his body, he's been rolled in mud. The Indians have rolled him in mud, and his skull has been bashed to where there are no pieces bigger than the palm of your hand. Just really murdered him. And so, so Calloway's dead. 2 years after Boonesboro, Calloway's dead by Shawnee Indians. So now cut to 2 years after this, and this is when Daniel Boone is sitting with this man who is interviewing him about Kentucky. Like, how did Kentucky come into being? And so Daniel Boone narrates this whole tale about his life, and it's called The Wars of Kentucky, and the frontier, how Kentucky came into being, and all this stuff. And the entire time, the entire book, it has not one mention of Richard Calloway. Well, there's only one, and it's when he's talking about the girls, and he says, my daughter Jemima and the 2 daughters of Richard Calloway. That's it. The entire book, no mention of Richard Calloway, because, I mean, obviously he's bitter. Well, so Daniel Boone, like I said, he leaves Boonesboro, and he never speaks of that court-martial. It's like a shameful time in his life. He doesn't speak of it. His family doesn't speak of it. All the court records from it go missing. And that book that the guy wrote, that, he had talked with Daniel Boone, this was just 2 years after Calloway dies. He's talking with Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone tells the whole of it. Calloway's not even mentioned. Well, this book comes out, and it's just really the exploits of Daniel Boone, and it makes him famous. I mean, world famous. So all these books, and then what starts is the whole, the lore of Daniel Boone, some of which may be true, some of which may not be true. You don't really know. But I just feel like your ancestor was really cheated. So, but Calloway County, at least Calloway County, Kentucky, is named after your ancestor, Dick Calloway. And there are actually a lot of Calloways. Like I said, they had a lot of sons. There were a lot of brothers. There are Calloways all over the place in Kentucky. It's like Kentucky royalty. So there's a Calloway Kin Facebook group. So I've joined this group, and I just got admission, and I'm gonna get on there first thing, and I'm gonna be like, what the frick? Like, why is it that Dick Calloway is getting bashed in all these biographies of Daniel Boone, when I totally think that he was right about Daniel Boone? So anyway, we'll see. I'll let you know what comes of that. But that is the story of Dick Calloway and his contribution to, Kentucky would become a state, I think in 1890. It would be like the 14th or 15th state, I think, admitted to the Union.